Long before formal courts or written constitutions, the Germanic Thing assembly met in open spaces where free men gathered to settle disputes, make decisions, and confirm leaders. There were no permanent buildings or standing officials overseeing it. What gave the Thing its strength were simple, repeated rules: who could speak, how judgment was given, and how decisions were accepted. These basic practices proved more durable than many empires built on force and bureaucracy. The Germanic Thing assembly survived because it rested on shared agreement, not imperial control. How could a gathering held in open fields without written laws or permanent rulers last longer than empires built on armies and stone? And what made the simple rules of the Germanic Thing assembly strong enough to hold communities together when imperial systems collapsed? Stay with Germanic Under Constraint as we explore how the Germanic Thing assembly worked and why its basic structure endured long after grand empires faded away. What the Germanic Thing actually was. The Germanic Thing assembly was a public legal gathering used by early Germanic peoples across northern and central Europe. It was not symbolic or mythical. It was a functioning institution of governance. It existed long before centralized kingdoms formed. Roman writers such as Tacitus mention similar assemblies among Germanic tribes in the 1st century. Later evidence from Scandinavia, Anglo-Saxon England, and continental Europe confirms that things continued for centuries. The Thing was not informal chaos. It had structure, expectation, and recognized procedure. It operated within known customs that everyone understood. It was a legal forum rooted in participation, not bureaucracy. Decisions were not handed down from distant officials. They emerged from people physically present, standing together in a defined place, speaking openly before witnesses who would remember what had been agreed. Where and how it met. Things were typically held in open-air locations. These were often fixed sites: hills, clearings, marked stones, or sacred groves. Archaeological evidence in Scandinavia shows designated Thing sites used repeatedly across generations. Meetings were usually scheduled at known intervals, often seasonally. Timing mattered because agricultural societies could not gather at random. Attendance was not optional for free men. Participation was part of belonging to the community. This regular rhythm gave the Thing continuity. It was not occasional crisis management. It was an expected civic function. The physical setting reinforced equality in a visible way, since there were no walls separating rulers from ordinary participants. Everyone stood under the same sky, hearing the same words, witnessing the same proceedings. Who participated? The Thing was composed primarily of free men. Women did not typically speak in the assembly, though they could be involved indirectly in disputes and inheritance matters. Local leaders, elders, and respected warriors often influenced decisions, but they did not replace the gathering itself. Authority flowed through the group. A chieftain or king might preside, but he did not rule above the Thing. He relied on its support. The assembly represented the collective will of the recognized community. Social standing mattered, yet even influential figures were constrained by public reaction. A proposal that failed to win visible approval could not simply be enforced. This created a culture where persuasion mattered as much as position. That distinction made it resilient. Law was spoken, not written. Early Germanic law was largely oral. It was preserved through memory and repetition. Legal specialists existed in some regions, but written codes were rare until later. Christian influence. Laws were recited publicly during assemblies. This ensured that they remained known to everyone. Because the law was spoken and heard repeatedly, it did not depend on archives or literacy. This oral system made the Thing adaptable. When circumstances changed, custom could adjust without rewriting formal statutes. Disputes were judged by remembered precedent rather than technical language. The absence of dense written rules meant fewer disputes over interpretation. Its flexibility prevented legal paralysis. Dispute resolution was central. One of the main purposes of the Thing was settling disputes. These could involve land boundaries, inheritance, injury, theft, or accusations of wrongdoing. The assembly heard claims in public, witnesses were called, oaths were sworn. In some cases, ordeals or formal oath-swearing rituals were used to determine truth when evidence was limited. The key element was publicity. Decisions were made openly and remembered collectively. This transparency discouraged false accusations because statements were made before neighbors and kin. Public resolution prevented private revenge from spiraling into long feuds. By transforming conflict into a structured process, the Thing reduced uncertainty and replaced anger with accepted outcomes. Compensation. Instead of endless feud, many Germanic legal systems relied on compensation payments, often called Wehrgeld, especially in cases of injury or death. The Thing supervised these settlements. Payment amounts were often structured by status and severity. Once compensation was accepted, further revenge was forbidden. This rule limited cycles of violence that could destabilize communities. Instead of imprisonment or execution as default punishment, balance was restored through payment and agreement. Compensation recognized harm while keeping individuals inside society rather than removing them permanently. This reduced internal collapse. It also created predictable expectations, which reduced impulsive retaliation and reinforced stability across generations. Leadership depended on assembly support. Germanic kings and chieftains did not govern without limits. Their legitimacy depended on recognition at assemblies. Leaders could be acclaimed or rejected publicly. If a ruler lost support, his authority weakened immediately. This system prevented unchecked concentration of power. The Thing acted as a stabilizing mechanism. It did not remove hierarchy, but it restricted abuse. A leader who ignored consensus risked isolation rather than obedience. When empires centralized authority in distant capitals, the Thing kept power local and visible. The constant need for approval anchored authority within community expectation instead of distant enforcement. Military and political decisions. The Thing was not only legal, it also addressed broader community decisions, including war and alliances. Tacitus described Germanic warriors clashing weapons in approval during assemblies. Military decisions required collective endorsement. This prevented leaders from dragging communities into unwanted conflict. Shared decision-making strengthened cohesion. Warriors fought knowing they had agreed. Participation in decision-making increased responsibility for outcomes. That consent reduced internal fracture. When losses occurred, blame did not rest on one individual alone, because the decision had been shared publicly. The Thing survived political change. As Germanic tribes formed kingdoms, the Thing did not disappear immediately. In Scandinavia, regional things continued into the medieval period. Iceland's Althing, founded in 930 CE, is one of the clearest examples of long-lasting assembly tradition. In Anglo-Saxon England, similar gatherings influenced royal councils. The structure adapted to monarchy and Christianity. Kings incorporated assemblies into broader governance rather than eliminating them outright. Because it was not tied to one empire, it outlived many. Its survival came from adaptability rather than rigid identity. Simplicity reduced corruption. The Thing did not require permanent tax officers, standing bureaucracies, or full-time judges. It functioned through temporary gathering and collective memory. This limited opportunities for corruption through administrative complexity. No large institutional machinery meant fewer points of systemic failure. Its simplicity reduced overhead and dependency. With fewer intermediaries, decisions were harder to manipulate secretly. When empires expanded administration, they increased fragility. Complex systems required constant maintenance. The Thing remained structurally light. That Thing remained structurally light. That lightness made destruction less catastrophic. Enforcement through community. The Thing had no police force. Enforcement came from reputation and communal obligation. If someone refused to accept a ruling, they risked outlawry, loss of protection from the community. Outlawry was severe because survival depended on belonging. This enforcement method was powerful without requiring prisons or constant surveillance. Being excluded meant vulnerability in a harsh environment. The system worked because exclusion was more dangerous than confinement. Social cohesion replaced physical confinement as the primary tool of enforcement. Why empires fell but the Thing endured. Empires require taxation systems, military logistics, central command, and territorial control. When those structures weaken, collapse spreads quickly. The Thing did not rely on distant administration. It required only people gathering at known times in known places. Its scale was local. Local systems are harder to destroy completely. That decentralization explains endurance. Even if one region was disrupted, others could continue independently. The absence of heavy infrastructure meant there was less to collapse. Transition into written law. Over time, as Christianity spread and literacy increased, Germanic law codes were written down. But many written codes preserved older assembly traditions. Kings still consulted assemblies. Public consent remained important. The written law did not erase the Thing. It formalized parts of it. This continuity shows that the assembly was not primitive chaos. It was a functioning governance model adaptable to changing times. Written law strengthened preservation but did not replace collective participation entirely. What made the thing durable? The Thing assembly lasted because it rested on clear principles. It relied on public participation, oral transparency, collective enforcement, limited authority, and structured compensation. These were not abstract ideals, they were practical tools that worked repeatedly. These principles required no empire to survive. They required shared memory and recurring gathering. Each meeting reinforced legitimacy through repetition. As empires rose and collapsed across Europe, assemblies continued in various forms. The Thing did not survive through conquest or domination. It survived because it met practical needs simply and consistently, allowing communities to govern themselves without heavy institutional weight. That is why its rules outlasted empires. The Germanic Thing assembly did not last because it looked impressive. It lasted because it worked. It gave people a place to speak, settle disputes, choose leaders, and protect balance in their own community. Its rules were simple, clear, and repeated in public. That clarity built trust. And in the end, simple rules practiced in the open proved harder to destroy than armies guarding thrones. The Germanic Thing assembly reminds us that lasting order does not always come from size or force. Sometimes it comes from people meeting face to face and agreeing on simple rules. What part of this system feels strongest to you today? Let your thoughts continue the discussion.